Chapter 21. The streets of Malian's Gate were almost empty. Goblins were nocturnal by nature, and the mid-morning sun fell on quiet streets and cracked cobblestones. The inhabitants were beginning to stir as Dane and his allies passed through the streets. A pair of goblin children peered out of a nest of garbage and cloth, and a well-dressed bugbear poured the contents of a chamber pot out of an upper window. A sweet sound filled the air, a woman's voice raised in wordless song, filling the air with joy and beauty. Almost unconsciously, Dane began walking toward the sound, but after a few steps, he found that his leg was trapped. It was Jode, who had latched on to his ankle. "That would be a harpy," he said, as the ethereal sound continued. "Not your best choice for a lunch companion." Pierce had put a hand on Lay's shoulder, preventing her from following the sound. They listened to the enchanting melody for a few moments before it finally faded away. A harpy took to the air from a nearby tower, a piece of dripping meat in one hand. Dane shook his head as they began to move again. What are creatures like that doing in a city anyway? Why hasn't the guard done something about them? "You may see these creatures as monsters," Lay remarked, "but many of them are as intelligent as you or I, and they're just trying to survive like the rest of us." She had caught a toe on one of the uneven cobblestones, and was using the dark wood staff to take the weight off of her right foot. "She's found a place in this community, and I'd lay gold that she paid for her breakfast. Most of the more exotic monsters here are employed by House Thrashk, which sells their services and vouches for their behavior." "Outside Malian's Gate, maybe," Jode said. "But remember those statues we found yesterday? I'm going to guess that the laws of the land don't always apply in this district." "It's possible. I was always told to stay out of the gate, and I don't think the watch would care about the death of an innocent goblin." Dane said. "What if those statues weren't the work of a Medusa? We've just met someone who could turn people to stone." "An interesting idea," Jode said. "But what would an old seamstress from Seer gain from petrifying goblins?" "What would she gain from petrifying Lay? Or me?" "Well, she'd be able to buy your sword from the pawnbroker when you reclaimed it." Dane touched his borrowed sword. "Don't remind me. Arian knows I've considered killing you to get it back." Jode flashed a disarming smile. In the distance, the harpy began to sing again. "You have to admit," he said, "it's a lovely sound." "Lovely," Dane said, scowling. An ogress was standing at the door to the temple. She wore a black skirt and a harness of black leather studded with brass spikes. Similar bands of spiked leather were wrapped around her massive calloused fists. She was remarkably well groomed for an ogress, especially in Malian's Gate. She seemed to have washed her dark hair at least once, and there was a surprising glint of intelligence in her eyes as she watched them approach. "Well," Lay murmured, as they came closer to the gate guardian, "it looks like we're in for a fight after all. Think you can handle her?" "I can't match her strength." "Let's hope she doesn't know what to do with it." Dane steeled himself and stepped up to the ogress. To his surprise, she moved to the side and bowed her head slightly. "She awaits," Her voice was gruff thunder, almost too rough to be understood. She struck the door with a leather-bound fist. There was an echoing boom, and the door swung open. Though the sun was high in the sky, the passage beyond was filled with shadow. "Could you be more specific?" Jode said, peering up at her knees. "Does she have a name? Is she bigger than a bugbear?" The ogress didn't even look down at him. "Enter and learn," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. The door swung closed after they passed under the arch, and the darkness was complete. Lay whispered a few words, and the golden studs on her armor burst into light. From the outside, the building appeared to be a forgotten temple to the sovereign host, abandoned centuries ago and left to crack and crumble. In the light of Lay's glowing armor, it was easy to see why it had been abandoned. A few supporting beams had fallen from the ceiling, and the floor was choked with dust and rubble. The slit windows had been filled in with mortar. "Somehow, I was expecting something a little grander," Jode said, looking around. "If you're going to bother to get your ogress to wash her hair, you'd think you'd dust your temple." "Is it safe?" Dane wondered, looking up at the ceiling. "I'm going to be massively disappointed if we came all this way to get crushed by a falling stone." "I think so," Lay said, squinting up in the darkness. "Though I wouldn't throw any stones." A cool breeze blew through the room. Dane looked for the source, but he couldn't see any openings. Then he noticed a dim orange light at the far end of the hall. Something set into the floor. "Over there! Let's go! Pierce, fall back, and follow." Pierce knocked an arrow to his string and held another in his palm. Dane drew sword and dagger, and Lay held the darkwood staff at the ready. Jode started whistling a cheerful Talenton tune, but stopped when Dane glared at him. "What?" he said. "You really think someone is going to set up an ambush by requiring Lay to fight a minotaur with her bare hands? I must admit, I never saw it coming." Dane continued to stare. "Fine," he sighed, drawing his stiletto. "Silent it is." Lay whispered a word of power, and the magical light faded. In the new fallen darkness, the glow at the end of the room was even more obvious. The three spread out in a semicircle and moved forward, with Pierce following 30 steps behind. Dane began to hear a low bubbling, the sound of thick boiling liquid. The source of the sound was also the source of the light. It appeared to be a pool of molten metal, almost 10 feet across. As they drew close, they could feel the heat and smell the fire. 9 stone altars were spread in a circle around the fiery pool, one for each of the lords of the sovereign host. The largest of the altars lay directly before them. It was a red granite and engraved with the hammer sigil of Onatar, the Lord of Fire and Forge. A large crack ran down the center of the altar, splitting the hammer in two. "What a fiendish trap," Jode whispered. "They know we'll never be able to resist leaping into the pool." Dane sighed and lowered his sword. "You're already caught in the fire." It took a moment for the words to register in Dane's ears. He was reminded of the harpy's song. It was pure beauty distilled into sound, unearthly and inhuman. The voice came from directly in front of them, and suddenly Dane noticed the vast black shadow crouched atop the broken altar of Onatar. Had it always been there, or had it appeared with the sound of the voice? The figure moved forward, and it was revealed by the light of the molten pool. A sphinx, She had the body of a great black cat, with the neck and head of a beautiful elf maiden, though if the head had been on a humanoid body, she'd have been 9 feet tall to match the scale. Her skin was flawless cream, her eyes glittering gold. Her long hair was midnight black, dropping down and mingling with the vast raven's wings folded on her back. The black of her fur and hair was striped with bands of brilliant orange, and these seemed to glow in the dim light. When she shifted, the stripes rippled like flame. She wore 3 chains around her neck, one of gold, one of silver, and one of black adamantine, and they too glittered in the light of the glowing pool. Dane was struck speechless. He'd seen strange creatures before. Some of the beasts they'd fought in the Mournland would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life, but he'd never encountered anything with the raw presence and the pure sense of inhuman majesty as the Sphinx. Those golden eyes seemed to probe within him. Then she spoke again. It was an impressive sight, but Dane found uneasy suspicion warring against his sense of wonder. Lay, Dane, Jode, have no fear. Come in peace, and you will be safe. Come forward, Pierce. I am Flamewind, and I have been expecting you. Struggling to find his voice, Dane said, "How could you know we were coming?" "Calm yourself." Her voice was so hypnotic that this was almost a command. "Destiny is like a flame. It consumes and destroys anything it touches," Jode said. Unlike Dane and the others, Jode was not affected by the majesty of the Sphinx. "Be careful what you suggest," the Sphinx said. "Your fate can certainly consume you and bring about great destruction. But the greater the flame, the more light it sheds, and the farther away it can be seen. I saw your fires burning in the Mournland. I watched as you approached, and I arranged for you to be here today." "And if we'd decided not to come?" Dane said. Flamewind smiled and said nothing. "So we didn't have a choice. Is that what you're trying to say?" "No. You have choice. You have power. But you do not always see the forces that move you. Why did you come this morning?" "Well, we tried to visit you yesterday, but the watch showed up." "Why?" "An old friend wanted to see me." "Why?" "I don't know. To warn me, I suppose." "And how did he know to find you here, in a place the watch does not watch?" "I don't know. Are you going to answer any questions, or do you just ask them?" The Flamewind turned her head, her golden eyes catching the light of the pool. "You will find out the answers in time, for now you must ask yourself the questions. I am not the only one who can see your flames. Others are watching, and they are shaping your path. The death of Hadran de Canith, the presence of your friend Alina, these are not accidents. Beware coincidence." Lay stepped forward, and now it was her eyes that burned in the darkness. "You know who killed Hadran? Tell me." Flamewind reared up and spread her wings. Golden feathers were hidden within the black, and for a moment she seemed to be surrounded by flame. "You killed him, Lay. Those watching you have plans for you, and a life with Hadran was not what they wished." "They? They who?" The Sphinx settled onto her haunches, folding her wings again. I cannot say I see your fires, but we who watch are hidden in the shadows. I will tell you this. All of your troubles are tied to your past, to who you are and those who have come before. Your fate is linked to your family, your parents, and your brothers. My parents are dead, Lay said, and I have no brothers. You carry the legacy of your line, and you have already met one of your brothers. You must forget your house and focus on your family. Stop! Stop! Lay cried. Take your stick and leave us alone. She hurled the dark wood staff at Flamewind. The staff froze in mid-air, then slowly drifted back to Lay and fell at her feet. The staff was never mine, Flamewind said. I simply arranged for it to come to you. There is little I can do for you except this gift. Pierce walked up behind Lay. He picked up the staff and put his other hand on her shoulder. Flamewind smiled slightly. Your friends will rely on your strength in days to come, but even you do not know your true strength, Pierce. What do you mean? Pierce said. Even Lay looked puzzled. Do you know what your purpose is, Pierce? I was designed to serve as a light infantry scout and support unit, specializing in stealth and reconnaissance. That is what you were told. That is what you have done. But it is far from the truth. You too must learn about your family. Pierce's metal faceplate was incapable of expression. I have no family. I was forged in the workshops of Seer. By whom? I do not know. If you wish to know your purpose, that is where you must begin. What about me? Jode said. Do I have mysterious family issues as well? Flamewind looked down at the little halfling. You know your family, Jode, and you know who you are. What matters are the choices that you will make in the next few hours. There is a key that only you can find, hidden between two stones that only you can move. You must find it alone, but you will pay a terrible price to do so. You have the power to end the suffering of others, but you will need to sacrifice all that you have. Why are you doing this? Dane said. If you know so much about our destinies, why the riddles? Why not just tell us what you know? The Sphinx looked at Dane and smiled. What answer do you wish to hear, Dane with no family name? That I am bound by divine and arcane laws and have told you all that I can? That I have told you what you need to know to fulfill your purpose in this world, or that I have my own plans, and I am shaping your destiny as much as any of the others who watch. Which is true? Which will you believe? I suppose you have a mysterious riddle for me? Flamewind looked at him. You have turned your back on your past, Dane. You sold your family soul long before Jode did. You will need to take up that sword again. The sword's as good as another. You don't believe that? The wielder determines the value of the sword. If you will not use what you have, you will never succeed. Dane said nothing. Her eyes glittered as she continued. You will have lost far more than your sword by the time the sun has set. You must make peace with the shadows if you are to survive. Enemies are all around you, and the deepest darkness is hidden within the light. Do you have any more parables, or are we done here? Just one more. There will come a time when you will be asked to give away your closest friend. Be careful, you will have to carry the consequences for the rest of your life. And you already know what I'll decide. Of course, but you haven't decided yet. Flamewind smiled one last time. I have said all that I can say, or all that I will say. Now go, your enemies await. She spread her wings and took to the air, disappearing into the shadows of the dome. Dane looked up after her, but she was nowhere to be seen. Chapter 22. Well, that certainly cleared things up, Dane said, kicking a piece of rubble. When they'd left the temple, the ogress was nowhere to be seen. However, the people of Malian's gate were beginning to stir. Bands of goblins were setting off for the workhouses, and up the street, a few bugbears were wrestling on a stoop. Lay and Pierce are supposed to go have a family reunion. You should start turning over stones, and I should get ready to suffer a big loss. And we've got 3 days to sort all this out before we're out on the street. I don't know, Jode said. I thought it was worth doing. When's the last time you saw a sphinx? I wonder if she participates in the races. Lay had taken the Darkwood staff from Pierce, and they had been walking in silence. Now she spoke again, though her thoughts seemed distant. I don't think so. Back when I was studying in Sharn, I remember hearing a story about a Morgrave expedition bringing a sphinx to the city. Where'd she come from? Jode asked. Jerwam? Zendrik, I think. Zendrik was a continent to the south, a land of secrets and mysteries. Dane had never been there, but he knew it was said to be the homeland of the elves, and the home of an ancient civilization of giants that had been destroyed millennia before the rise of humanity. A group of explorers found her in the jungles, Lake continued. Or she found them, depending on how you look at it. As I heard the story, the Sphinx said she'd been waiting for the explorers, and that she would be returning to Sharn with them. They took her along because you don't meet a Sphinx every day. Supposedly, she was hidden away at the university, talking to sages about Zendrik. No one ever said anything about a temple in Malian's gate. That I know for certain. So, do you think that we should give any weight to any of this? Dane asked. I don't know. She knew we were here. She knew who we were. And Uncle Jura seemed to take her seriously. For whatever reason. The ogress! The ogress wasn't there when we left, Jode said. Yes, I think we all noticed that, Dane said. I was just wondering if you'd ever seen a female minotaur before. Is it easy to tell the genders apart? I don't know. Why? Never mind. I'm sure it's nothing. Dane began to protest. Then he looked down the street, and the words died in his throat. 3 hobgoblin warriors were spread out across the street, all wearing the spiked leather armor common to Dargoon. Stealing a glance over his shoulder, he saw a bugbear and two more hobgoblins stepping out into the street behind them. "Hold," he said quietly. His comrades paused in mid-stride, and they formed a loose circle to guard their backs. "Tash Galdar," Dane called out, hailing them in the goblin tongue. "Strength to your arms." The hobgoblins seemed slightly surprised to hear their own language. One of the warriors in front stepped forward. Hobgoblins stood between the tiny goblins and massive bugbears in height and build. While they lacked the inhuman strength of the bugbears, hobgoblins were tough and quick. This wasn't one of the largest hobgoblins Dane had dealt with, but he moved with a sinister grace. He had striped his black armor with streaks of crimson, an odd design, but that wasn't what disturbed Dane. The hobgoblin carried a heavy chain studded with spikes. A chainmaster. Dane cursed under his breath. He had fought Dargul chainmasters before, and they weren't pleasant memories. "What brings you to this place, outsider?" said the hobgoblin. "I could ask the same, chainmaster," Dane said, continuing to speak in goblin. He had served with Darguls before and after he joined the army of Seer, and he could tell that these five were looking for a fight. But there were many ways he could make it difficult for them. "This is not the land of the Galdar. What brings you to a city of men?" "Your failure, homeless one. With your land destroyed, the other humans have called a halt to battle. There is no war to the north, and so we have come here. Perhaps you can pay for the mistakes of your country." Dane felt his anger growing. "Who failed first? Our greatest mistake was trusting the honor of the Galdar. Your ancestors were paid to protect the nation of Seer, and you turned on those who trusted you." The hobgoblin bared his teeth and set the end of his chain whirling, but as Dane had hoped, the other warriors held back. Dane had made this an argument between the two of them, a contest of honor. One way or another, the leader needed to prove himself against Dane before the others would support him. "It was always our land," the chainmaster said. "Your kind stole it long ago. Our king has reclaimed what was ours by right." The other warriors nodded, but Dane had anticipated this response. "My ancestors claimed this land with fire and sword. The Galdar fled before them. Is treachery the only way you can win it back?" The hobgoblin hissed and sent his chain spinning forward, but Dane was ready. In one move he leaped up and over the chain and lunged for the hobgoblin, blades in hand. Stepping backward to keep Dane at a distance, the hobgoblin shifted his grip, and the chain came whirling out again, catching Dane's sword and pulling it free. But Dane had fought chainmasters before, and he'd expected this move. Sword now gone, he lashed out with his dagger, and the adamantine blade sliced through the steel links as if they were cloth. A second slash scattered spiked links across the street, leaving the warrior holding a tiny scrap of chain. Dane raised the point of the dagger and kept it in line with the hobgoblin as he knelt to recover his long sword, pulling it free from the entangling chain. "I hope this time you will have the honor to admit your defeat," said Dane, smiling. Perhaps it was the smile that did it. Perhaps he'd overestimated the honor of the Galdar hobgoblins. Whatever the case, Dane realized he'd pushed things too far. The hobgoblin flung the remnants of his shattered chain, and as Dane sidestepped away, his opponent drew a jagged broadsword. "Sharat Kor," he said. This goaded his companions into action. The warriors began to circle Dane and his allies, searching for an opening. "Stand ready," Dane said, sliding into guard and waiting for the charge. But the attack never came. A high female voice called out in Goblin, interrupting the battle.
Leave him alone, Jackat. Leave him be, unless you plan to drink your own blood.
The hobgoblin hissed, but he paused and looked over his shoulder to the source of the voice. Dane stole a glance as well and blinked in surprise. The speaker was the goblin girl he'd met on the lift from Denias, the thief who had stolen his purse. "Begone, girl," the hobgoblin snapped. "This is business of the Galdar. No place for city folk who have lost touch with our ways."
You are in my home, Jackat, and you do not know our ways. We know better than to drink poisoned Carluat, but I've seen a number of you dark ghouls make that mistake. Besides, the Stone Eye wants to see him. Perhaps you'd like to explain the delay.
Jackat looked askance at that. The other hobgoblins lowered their weapons and took a step back. "Fine," said the hobgoblin. "Take him." He looked at Dane, spat at the ground, then turned and walked away.
Dane, Lay whispered, as someone who doesn't speak Goblin, would you tell me what's going on?
"I'm still trying to figure that out," he said. He looked over to the little girl. "It seems that there's more to you than meets the eye," he said in the common tongue of Galifar. "I suppose I should thank you for helping us. I'm not in the habit of being rescued by thieves." Looking at her now, it was clear that the girl had been playing a role on the lift. Dane remembered hearing that the short-lived goblinoids matured faster than humans, and clearly the girl's wide-eyed, "I just wanted to see the sky," burbling, had been an act. He'd been thinking of her as a child of 6, but her level gaze had the focus of a young adult.
"You saved me on the lift," she said in the tongue of Galifar. Her voice was so childish and sweet that it was difficult to take her seriously. "And you did give me all that money. It was the least I could do."
I didn't exactly give you that money."
"I know, but you had it just hanging there, and I know you saw me."
She looked at Jode, who grinned.
"I thought you just didn't want to give it to me in front of the guards." "What did you just do?" Lay asked. "Who are you?"
The girl studied Lay carefully.
"I'm Rosala. Those mean Darghouls sleep at my father's hostel, so they know better than to cross me. And I told them someone important wanted to see you."
They nodded. "Well, thanks, Rosala. Since I imagine you don't have the money anymore, I guess we'll just have to call it even and be on our way."
"You can't do that."
"Why not?"
"I told you. Someone important wants to see you."
You weren't just making that up.
"You don't joke about the Stone Eye. If you don't come, I don't know what he's going to do to me."
Dane sighed and looked at the other three. "Well, I suppose we can take a few more minutes before following up on all of our other leads. What do you think?" There were general nods of assent. He turned back to Rosala. "Fine. Lead on." The people of Malian's Gate seemed to know Rosala. Many waved as the goblin girl passed by. Others looked away or studiously ignored the girl and her traveling companions. As they continued deeper into the district, they began to see more statues. A hobgoblin warrior in full armor, his flail broken off halfway up the handle. An angry bugbear with one arm missing. A pair of goblins encrusted with mildew and mold.
I'll give you one guess as to what Old Stone Eye is,
Jode murmured, touching his eye and then pointing to one of the statues. A Medusa. You think? Dane frowned. But the girl said he. You listen to too many stories. Where do you think little Medusas come from? Phoenix eggs? Wonderful. Rosala stopped at an old, run-down building, a tavern, with boards over the windows, seemingly abandoned for centuries. There were 2 doors, one sized for goblins, gnomes, and halflings, and the other large enough to admit an ogre. The girl tapped out a complex pattern of knocks on the larger door, and a moment later, it slid open. Rosala stepped inside and motioned for them to follow. The door guards were tall, powerful humanoids covered with shaggy, spotted fur. Their heads featured long canine ears, glowing green eyes, and long snouts filled with sharp teeth. Gnolls, Dane guessed, though he'd never actually seen one before. Gnolls were natives of the land of Droam to the west. Droam was the home of harpies and trolls, and according to bedtime stories, these were the least of its terrors. The last werewolves were said to lurk in the depths of the forests of Droam, and the barren Bieshk Mountains were home to Medusas, basilisks, and other horrible creatures. A gnoll might be a match for a bugbear, but not as bright, and the presence of the gnolls hinted at greater horrors that might lie deeper in the building. Rosala exchanged a few words with the door guards, speaking in a language he didn't know. After an exchange of snarls and grunts, she led them deeper into the old inn. The common room of the inn had been transformed into a barracks. Gnolls, goblins, and even a few ogres were sitting on pallets spread around the room, sharpening weapons and sharing stories or jokes. Rosala led them through the common room and the kitchen back to what must have once been the innkeeper's quarters. A lone figure stood before a small shrine constructed from strange, inhuman bones. The stranger, shrouded in a long, hooded cloak of green wool, was facing away from them. The back of the hood seemed to shift slightly as they entered, and despite the raucous chatter from the common room, Dane heard a hiss.
Lord Caslack?
Rosala said.
I've brought them.
The stranger rose and turned around. His hood was pulled down to cover his eyes and upper face, but Jode had clearly guessed correctly. Where Caslack's skin was exposed, it was covered with coppery scales, and a few vipers were peering out of the depths of the hood. Dane and the others dropped their eyes, and Dane's hand went to the hilt of his sword. There is no need to draw your sword. I mean you no harm. At this time, the Medusa said. His voice was smooth and sibilant. Can he see through the eyes of his snakes? Dane wondered. He'd never really considered the relationship between a Medusa and its mane of serpents. Glad to hear it, Dane said. Please be seated. The Medusa gestured at the chairs scattered around the room. I am Caslack. I'm afraid I don't know your names. Dane sat down. I'm Dane. My companions are Lay, Jode, and Pierce. A pleasure, Caslack said, dipping his hooded head. Rajala, you may stay, but please close the door. He walked over to a desk set against the northern wall and idly shifted a few sheets of parchment while he talked. Sharn was built by the hands of the goblins, and Malian's Gate has been their home for centuries. The goblins have long been mistreated by humanity and its cousins, but nonetheless, a balance had been struck. That changed with the rise of Dargoon, as the larger and more powerful goblinoids emerged from their mountain fortresses to spread across the land. The Darghouls have their own traditions, and over the last few decades the power of balance had been lost. And where do Medusas fit into this history lesson? Dane asked. I'm no sage, but I didn't think that you were part of the same family tree. Patience. A serpent peered around the cowl and hissed softly. As the Darghouls have come from the east, we of Dro-Wam have come from the west. Since before the age of Galifar, we have been seen as monsters, and in truth, our history has been one of violence and bloodshed. But this has changed over the last century. As War tore your nations apart, the daughters of Sorakel called us together, uniting the warlords under one banner. The daughters saw great promise in commerce with your kind, and indeed, many of your people sought our warriors for their strength, especially in battle. Dane could attest to this. While he'd mainly fought in the south, he'd heard tales of ogre irregulars fighting along the western front, and they hadn't been pleasant stories. But we have much to offer besides our power in battle. The daughters have sent us east to work with your dragon-marked houses and forge new bonds between our nations. Does this involve us somehow? The two snakes hissed this time, but Kastak's voice was as smooth and emotionless as ever. Ogres, trolls, hobgoblins, bugbears. There is fire in the blood of these races, and conflict is in their nature, but it does not serve our purposes to fight one another. The Sharn Watch has long left this area alone, but someone needs to maintain order. This is my role. Should there be trouble in the district, I wish to know the source of it, and if I can put an end to it. Dane began to see what was going on. Well, that's kind of you. And don't think we don't appreciate it. But those Darghouls were just looking for trouble. I don't think there's anything unusual there. Nor do I. But the Sharn Watch came into the district in search of you. The first time in years that they've set foot in the gate. And I understand that you entered the broken temple. Yet here you are, alive. That's a surprise? I see you know little about the history of our home. That may explain why you went to the temple to begin with. In any case, I would like to know your business with the Watch, and whether we should be expecting them to return. I also wish to know why you entered the broken temple, and how you survived that experience. And I'd like a magic ring that grants wishes, Dane said. The Medusa snakes hissed angrily, but the goblin girl laughed. Kastak stood and walked toward Dane. You are refusing to answer. Dane took a deep breath, then stood and faced Kastak, all too aware of the deadly gaze hidden behind a flimsy hood. It's good that you're trying to keep this place under control, and I'm glad I didn't have to sully my blade with hobgoblin blood back on the street, but I can't answer your questions. I don't know why the Watch broke the rules and came in here after me. I'd tell you if I did. As for what happened in the temple, it sounds to me like you should know better than to ask. There was a long pause. Dane could almost feel the Medusa's eyes locked onto him from beneath the green hood, and he wondered if he could draw his sword and strike before Caslack could pull back his hood. Then the Medusa let out his breath in a long hiss. You may go. Rosala will see you safely to the edge. Dane turned to the door, then paused. Caslack, he said, do you keep basilisks? Basilisks are dangerous creatures, the Medusa said. What use would I have for one? I was just wondering if a basilisk might have disappeared around 3 weeks ago, Dane said, or at least one of its eyes. Anyhow, if you want to talk about it, I suggest you drop by the Manticore in High Walls. We won't be coming back here again.